My name is Callie Black. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I was known as the dependable one. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon, in a family that believed in structure, stability, and sensible choices. Today, I work as a financial analyst. At least, that's what my resume says. If you asked my parents, they would describe me as practical, steady, and responsible. The kind of daughter who doesn't make waves. The kind who understands sacrifice. People often assume I am gentle in a way that borders on fragile, soft-spoken, cooperative, easy to guide. In family gatherings, I was the listener. In disagreements, I was the one who nodded. I learned early that silence keeps rooms calm, that compliance keeps love predictable. What most people didn't see was that my silence was never emptiness. It was an observation. It was patience. It was a long internal negotiation between who I was expected to be and who I quietly knew I was becoming. This story is not about rebellion in the dramatic sense. There were no slam doors, no screaming matches, no ultimatums shouted across dinner tables. What happened was quieter than that, slower, more deliberate. It's about the weight of expectations that look like love. It's about the invisible contracts families draft for you before you're old enough to sign your own name. It's about realizing that living a life that feels acceptable is not the same as living a life that feels like yours. For years, I've followed the path that made sense on paper. I chose the safe major. I accepted the stable job. I stayed close to home. I listened carefully when my parents said, "We just want what's best for you." And I believed them. But somewhere beneath the gratitude and the obedience, there was a quiet question I couldn't ignore anymore. What if best wasn't the same as mine? The decision to walk away from everything, security, approval, the version of me everyone understood, didn't happen overnight. It happened in fragments, in small realizations, in moments where I noticed how tired I felt, pretending to be satisfied. When I finally chose my own path, it wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was terrifying. It meant disappointing the people who raised me. It meant stepping into uncertainty without applause. It meant accepting that love doesn't always mean agreement. This isn't a revenge story. I didn't leave to prove anyone wrong. I left because staying would have meant betraying myself. Over the next hour, I want to tell you how that shift happened, how quiet compliance turned into quiet clarity, and how walking away became the most honest thing I've ever done. If you've ever felt grateful for a life that still didn't feel like yours, have you ever wondered what it would take to choose yourself anyway? To my family, I was the easy one. My older brother, Daniel, was brilliant but volatile. He changed majors twice, started businesses that never lasted more than a year, fell in and out of love like it was seasonal. Every family gathering had at least one update about Daniel, either a new ambition or a new recovery plan. I was the contrast, the stable one, the safe one, the one who never worried anyone. At least, that's how they described me. When relatives visited, my mother would smile and say, "Callie's doing wonderfully. She's always been so responsible." My father would nod with quiet pride and add, She understands the value of hard work. I learned to accept those sentences, like medals pinned gently to my chest. But medals are heavy if you wear them long enough. I didn't resent Daniel. In many ways, I admired his freedom. When he quit his corporate job to find himself in Spain, my parents were anxious but indulgent. He just needs time, they'd say. When I mentioned once, just once, that I had considered applying to a design residency in New York after college, the room went quiet in a different way. My father cleared his throat. "That's not exactly stable, Callie." My mother added softly, "You've always been the practical one." It wasn't criticism. It was a classification, and I fit into it. I studied finance instead of visual design. I accepted a job offer 2 weeks before graduation. I signed a lease 5 miles from my childhood home. I told myself that security was a form of gratitude. They never forced me. That's what made it complicated. No one ever said, "You're not allowed." They said, "Are you sure that's wise?" They said, "We just don't want you to struggle." They said, "You're too smart to take unnecessary risks." And I began to equate risk with irresponsibility. At family dinners, I listened more than I spoke. I updated them on promotions, raises, and retirement contributions. My success was measurable and therefore reassuring. I became fluent in the language of safety. I knew how to make decisions that earned nods of approval. I knew how to downplay ideas that sounded uncertain. I knew how to present my life like a stable investment portfolio, diversified, predictable, low volatility. But inside, something quieter was happening. I kept that leather notebook in my drawer, the one no one knew about. In it were sketches of small studio spaces, budget breakdowns for starting an independent consultancy, ideas for workshops I wanted to host, a different version of my life, outlined in pencil like a blueprint no one had commissioned. I wasn't unhappy. That's the part people misunderstand. I was competent, comfortable, appreciated, but I was also contained. My parents loved me. I never doubted that. They attended every award ceremony, helped with my first down payment, called every Sunday. Yet their love came with an invisible assumption that I would remain who I had always been to them: reliable, predictable, available. The daughter who stayed close, the daughter who chose wisely, the daughter who did not disrupt the ecosystem. And for a long time, I played that role beautifully. If you had asked me then whether I felt trapped, I would have said no. I would have told you I was grateful. I would have explained that adulthood is about compromise. But gratitude can coexist with quiet misalignment. And the version of me they were proud of was only part of the truth. The rest of me was waiting. The first time it happened, it was so small no one else noticed. It was a Sunday dinner, the kind we had almost every week. My mother made roast chicken. My father opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for something special, though nothing particularly special had happened. We were talking about Daniel again, his latest pivot. He had decided to launch a travel-based YouTube channel. My parents exchanged that familiar mixture of worry and indulgence. "He just needs support," my mother said gently. "He'll land on his feet," my father added. I nodded, as I always did. It was a normal question, harmless. I hesitated for half a second before answering. "It's fine. Actually, I've been thinking about something." Three pairs of eyes shifted toward me. I've been considering taking a year to build something on my own, a financial literacy platform. Maybe combine it with design workshops. I've been sketching out a model. Silence, not dramatic silence, just stillness. My father set his glass down slowly. You have a promotion coming up, don't you? Yes, I said, but this would be different. It's something I've wanted to try for a while. My mother smiled, but it was tight. Sweetheart, that sounds ambitious. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Wait, you? Going rogue? He laughed lightly, like it was a charming joke. I smiled too. Reflex. I wouldn't call it rogue, I said. Just independent. My father cleared his throat. Callie, you've worked very hard to get where you are. Walking away from a stable position for an idea, especially in this economy, doesn't seem like you. Doesn't seem like you. That was the sentence. It landed softly, almost kindly, but it cut, because what he meant was, the version of you we understand would never do that. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand. We just don't want you to jeopardize everything you've built. Jeopardize, as if pursuing something that felt alive was a form of recklessness. Daniel shrugged. I mean, if you're bored, just take a vacation. No need to blow up your whole life. Blow up your whole life. I hadn't said anything about blowing anything up. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Just a quiet awareness. If Daniel announced a risky move, he was finding himself. If I suggested one, I was jeopardizing stability. I realized, sitting there with my fork paused above my plate, that my identity in that family was not just admired, it was managed. They relied on me to be the constant, the control group, the proof that their parenting strategy worked. And without meaning to, I had reinforced that role for years. So I did what I always did. I softened. I'm not quitting tomorrow, I said calmly. It's just an idea. My father nodded with visible relief. Ideas are good. Just don't be impulsive. Impulsive. I had spent my entire life being the opposite of impulsive. The conversation moved on. Dessert was served. Daniel described his travel gear. My mother asked me about my 401k contributions. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but I couldn't unhear it. Doesn't seem like you. That night, back in my apartment, I opened my leather notebook. I reread the plans I'd sketched over the past year, the projections, the timelines, the savings milestones I had quietly reached. Nothing about it was impulsive. In fact, it was the most carefully thought out idea I'd ever had. And yet, in their eyes, it was out of character. For the first time, I wondered something uncomfortable. Had I become so consistent in meeting expectations that they no longer believed I had dimensions? It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a rejection. It was something subtler. They trusted me, as long as I stayed within the version of me they recognized. And that realization stayed with me longer than the dinner did. After that dinner, I told myself I was overthinking. They hadn't yelled. They hadn't forbidden anything. They hadn't mocked me outright. If anything, they'd been protective. That's what I told myself. But the pattern didn't disappear. It refined itself. A few weeks later, my firm hosted a networking event downtown. I invited my parents to stop by for the public portion. It felt like something they'd be proud of. I was leading a short presentation on long-term wealth planning for young professionals. They came. My mother wore the navy dress she reserved for important occasions. My father shook hands firmly, introducing himself as if he were part of the board. After my presentation, Several people approached me with questions. A woman from a startup asked if I'd ever considered consulting independently. A man from a community nonprofit wanted to collaborate on financial workshops. I felt energized, not because of the praise, but because of the possibility. On the drive home, I mentioned it casually. Someone asked if I'd consider consulting on my own. I said, watching the streetlights blur past the windshield. My father chuckled. Of course they did. You're good at what you do. There was a pause. But it's different when you're backed by a firm, he added. Credibility matters. My mother nodded. It's safer this way. Why take on unnecessary stress? Unnecessary stress. Again, subtle. Again, reasonable. But beneath it was an assumption. Independence equals danger. I stared out the window and felt something unfamiliar. Not hurt exactly, more like erosion. Small grains of certainty are wearing down. At work, I began noticing something else. Whenever I mentioned long-term strategic ideas, branching into creative financial education, blending analytics with design, colleagues would smile indulgently. That's very niche, one senior partner told me. Focus on climbing the ladder first, another advised. Climbing the ladder. No one asked whether I wanted the ladder, and slowly I began to internalize the script. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is just a phase. Maybe stability is maturity. I became efficient at dismissing my own instincts. When new ideas surfaced, I categorized them as unrealistic. When excitement flickered, I translated it into distraction. It was easier that way, but what unsettled me most wasn't the discouragement itself. It was how normalized it felt. At family dinners, Daniel's unpredictability was discussed like the weather. Inevitable, but forgivable. My restlessness, on the other hand, was treated like a glitch in an otherwise perfect system. You've always been the steady one, my mother would say. It sounded like praise, but it also sounded like a boundary. The more they repeated it, the more I felt myself shrinking to fit it. And I cooperated. I stopped mentioning my plans. I stopped sharing my sketches. I stopped saying, I've been thinking about. Instead, I updated them on promotions and bonuses. They relaxed. Approval returned, and that approval felt warm, comforting, familiar, which made the quiet compromise harder to confront because nothing overtly cruel was happening. No one was shouting. No one was insulting me. No one was forbidding anything. They were simply narrowing me, and I was allowing it. One evening, while reorganizing my apartment, I found an old portfolio from college, design projects I'd completed before switching majors. I flipped through the pages slowly. The colors were bold, the concepts ambitious, the handwriting in the margins is hopeful. I barely recognized that version of myself, not because she was naive, but because she hadn't yet learned how easily encouragement can turn into containment. That night, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. If I keep accepting the role they give me, I can't resent them for believing it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defiant. It was just honest. And honesty, I was beginning to realize, is where quiet change begins. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like reading a contract you've technically agreed to, but never fully examined. I began noticing the language people used around me. At work, I was the anchor, the one assigned to stabilize volatile clients, the one trusted with sensitive accounts because I was measured. When leadership changes were discussed, my name came up as someone who would maintain continuity. At home, I was the reliable daughter, the one who could be counted on to organize holiday dinners when my mother felt overwhelmed, the one who explained investment plans to my aunt, the one who stayed close enough to visit on short notice. None of these roles was negative. They were flattering, but they shared a common thread. I existed to stabilize other people's uncertainty. I started to see it clearly during a family brunch one Saturday. Daniel had decided to move again, this time to Austin, chasing a collaboration opportunity. My parents were stressed, trying to process another unpredictable shift. My mother turned to me and sighed. "At least we don't have to worry about you." She said it with affection. But something in me tightened. Not having to worry about me meant I was not allowed to change. It meant I was a fixed point in their emotional map, and fixed points don't get to drift. That afternoon, I walked home instead of driving. The air was cold, sharp against my cheeks. I kept replaying her sentence, "At least we don't have to worry about you." I realized that my consistency wasn't just appreciated, it was relied upon. If Daniel represented risk, I represented reassurance. If he explored, I endured. And somewhere along the way, I had internalized the belief that disrupting that balance would be selfish. Because if I stepped into uncertainty, who would play the steady one? That question haunted me more than their disapproval ever could. I thought about the financial literacy platform I'd been outlining, the hybrid creative workshops, the possibility of relocating to a city where no one knew me as the stable one. Every version of that future required me to stop fulfilling a role that kept everyone else comfortable. And comfort is addictive. When you're praised for being dependable, you start to measure your worth by how little disruption you cause. I began asking myself uncomfortable questions. Was I choosing stability because it aligned with my values, or because it protected my identity? There's a difference. One evening, my father called to ask if I could review some paperwork for him. It was routine. He trusted my expertise. "Of course," I said. After we hung up, I noticed how automatic my response had been. Of course. I was always available, always capable, always steady, but rarely expands. I opened my leather notebook again. I reviewed the savings account I had quietly grown over the past 3 years, enough to sustain myself for 12 months if I planned carefully. I had told no one about it. That secrecy felt less like rebellion and more like preservation. For the first time, I allowed myself to articulate it clearly. The role they assigned me was not malicious, but it was limiting. And the most unsettling truth of all, I had accepted it because it earned love. I wasn't invisible in my family. I was valued. But I was valued for remaining consistent. The moment I imagined stepping outside that consistency, I could almost feel the tension it would create. Disappointment, concern, confusion. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else. Relief. Because naming the role meant I could choose whether to continue playing it. The steady daughter, the stabilizer, the predictable one. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I let that identity soften, not explode, not collapse, just shift. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen at a dramatic crossroads or after a tearful confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room with frosted glass walls. I was presenting a quarterly performance review to senior leadership. Charts, forecasts, risk mitigation strategies. I spoke clearly and confidently. I answered questions before they were fully formed. When I finished, there was a brief silence, then nods of approval. "Excellent work, Callie. my managing director said. This is why you're on track for partner. On track. There it was again. The language of direction, of a path already mapped. I smiled, thanked them, and gathered my notes. As I walked back to my office, something felt hollow. Not disappointment. Not exactly. It was the realization that I had just achieved something I was supposed to want. And I felt nothing. I closed my office door and sat down. The city's skyline stretched beyond the glass windows. I imagined my life 5 years from now if I stayed. Partner track, higher income, larger apartment, more responsibility, more respect. The image was clear, and it felt like watching someone else's future. That evening, instead of driving home, I walked along the waterfront. The air smelled faintly of rain. People hurried past me, wrapped in their own destinations. I sat on a bench and opened my leather notebook. For months, the pages had been filled with numbers and outlines. But that day, I didn't calculate anything. I wrote a question. If nothing about my current life was wrong, why does it feel unfinished? I stared at the sentence for a long time because nothing was wrong. My family loved me. My job respected me. My finances were stable. There was no villain, no crisis, no collapse forcing my hand, which made the discomfort harder to justify. But as I sat there, watching the river move steadily in one direction, I realized something simple. Flowing in the right direction feels different from drifting in a safe one. I had been drifting safely. Every choice I made was defensible, sensible, applauded, but none of them felt chosen. I thought back to that college portfolio I'd found weeks earlier. The bold colors, the ambitious margins, the version of me who hadn't yet categorized her instincts as impractical. When had I decided that practicality and authenticity were opposites? The shift wasn't explosive, it was quiet clarity. I didn't want to be reckless. I didn't want to burn bridges. I didn't want to disappoint anyone out of spite. But I also didn't want to wake up at 40 and realize I had lived entirely within a framework designed to keep everyone else comfortable. For the first time, I admitted something to myself without softening it. If I stay, it will not be because I have to. It will be because I'm afraid to unsettle the image they have of me. That was the pivot. Not anger, not rebellion, just responsibility. Responsibility for my own alignment. The river kept moving. No drama, no applause, just direction. I closed my notebook and stood up. I didn't quit my job the next day. I didn't announce anything. But internally, the conversation changed. Instead of asking, "Is this safe enough?" I began asking, "Is this mine?" And once you start asking that question, it becomes very hard to ignore the answer. After that afternoon by the river, I didn't become louder. I became quieter. But it was a different kind of quiet. Before, my silence had been compliance. It was the absence of friction, the instinct to smooth tension before it forms. Now my silence became strategic. I stopped announcing ideas before they were fully formed. I stopped seeking early validation. I stopped testing fragile dreams in rooms that were invested in my consistency. At Sunday dinners, when my mother asked about work, I gave her the facts: promotions, projects, numbers. I didn't mention the online course I had started building at night. When my father reminded me how close I was to partnership, I nodded thoughtfully. I didn't mention the LLC paperwork I had quietly researched. It wasn't secrecy out of resentment. It was incubation. There's a difference. At work, I began observing more carefully. I noticed which clients valued innovation versus tradition. I paid attention to the operational gaps in financial education for creatives and freelancers. Instead of arguing for change within the firm, I documented what the firm would never prioritize. Every limitation became data, and something else happened. People mistook my silence for contentment. "You've really settled into your role," my managing director said one afternoon. My mother commented during dinner, "You seem so calm lately." Calm? They thought I had accepted my trajectory completely. In reality, I had simply stopped negotiating it out loud. There's a quiet power in not telegraphing your next move. When you've always been predictable, stillness feels like confirmation to others. They don't realize it can also be preparation. Daniel called me one evening, excited about a new sponsorship deal. "I don't know how you do it," he said casually. "Staying in one place, same job, same city, I'd feel trapped." I smiled, though he couldn't see me. Stability has its advantages. And it did. A stable income meant I could accelerate my savings. A predictable schedule meant I could build evenings into productive blocks. A strong reputation meant I could leave without burning credibility. Silence gave me leverage. I began setting aside a specific percentage of every bonus into a separate account, labeled simply Transition. No one knew it existed. At night, instead of streaming shows, I refined curriculum outlines. I designed mock branding concepts. I reached out quietly to two mentors I trusted outside my family circle. One of them, a former professor, listened carefully as I explained my idea. "Why haven't you done this already?" she asked. I paused, because it would disrupt expectations. She was silent for a moment, then said gently, "Callie, disruption isn't always destruction." That sentence stayed with me. Back home, I wrote it in my notebook. The most interesting part of this phase wasn't the planning. It was the emotional detachment. For the first time, my parents' approval felt warm, but not necessary. I still loved them, still helped when they called, still showed up for birthdays and holidays. But internally, I had begun separating love from alignment. They could care about me deeply and still not understand my direction. Both could be true, and because I no longer felt the need to convince them prematurely, the pressure softened. Silence stopped being suppression. It became sovereign. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was preparing for autonomy. No one noticed the shift, which in many ways was the point. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like someone is going to work every morning, answering emails, attending meetings, and showing up to family dinners on time. That's why no one noticed. They didn't see the second calendar I kept, color-coded and layered with quiet milestones. They didn't see the spreadsheet titled Runway, mapping exactly how long I could sustain myself without a corporate salary. They didn't see the hours between 9:30 p.m. and midnight, slowly transforming into architecture for a different life. During the day, I was still the composed senior analyst. I delivered reports early. I mentored junior associates. I accepted praise with modesty. At night, I became a builder. I enrolled in a certification program for financial coaching, something adjacent enough to my current career to make sense, but different enough to create flexibility. I studied branding, not from a place of fantasy, but from market analysis. If creatives struggled with financial literacy, what language did they respond to? What visuals lowered intimidation? What pricing structure respected their instability without undervaluing my expertise? I wasn't chasing inspiration. I was engineering independence. The more I prepared, the calmer I felt. Because preparation turns fear into math. One evening, my mother called unexpectedly. "Your father mentioned you seem distant lately," she said carefully. "Is everything all right at work?" There it was again. The assumption that any internal shift must be linked to corporate instability. "I'm fine," I replied, "just focused." She exhaled softly. "We just don't want you carrying too much on your own." The irony almost made me smile. I was carrying something on my own. But it wasn't a burden. It was momentum. After we hung up, I opened my notebook and listed what I had already accomplished in secret. 12 months of living expenses saved, a draft curriculum for 3 workshop modules, a basic website framework. 2 potential collaborators are interested in pilot sessions. Legal research nearly complete for forming my own company. None of it was impulsive. None of it was reckless. If anything, it was the most methodical thing I had ever done. And yet, if I had announced it prematurely, it would have been treated like instability. That contrast fascinated me. Daniel once jumped into a venture with half a plan and full enthusiasm, and the family rallied around him with cautious optimism. I was building a foundation brick by brick, and I knew the reaction would be concern, not because my plan lacked structure, but because it disrupted the role. One Saturday afternoon, my father asked if I could help him rebalance a small investment portfolio. As we sat at the kitchen table reviewing numbers, he said, "You know, Callie, consistency is underrated. People chase excitement and end up exhausted." I met his eyes. "I agree," I said. And I meant it. I wasn't chasing excitement. I was chasing alignment. The distinction mattered to me, even if no one else could see it yet. Preparation also changed something internal. The more competent I felt in designing my own path, the less I resented anyone for not understanding it. Resentment thrives on helplessness. Clarity dissolves it. There were nights when doubt crept in, when I calculated worst-case scenarios, imagined awkward conversations, and pictured the disappointment in my mother's eyes. But every time doubt surfaced, I returned to the data. Savings account balance, projected income streams, skill inventory, network strength. I wasn't leaping into emptiness. I was building a bridge quietly behind a curtain. And what they never noticed, what no one noticed, was that the version of me they relied on was not disappearing. She was evolving. The discipline they admired, I was applying it to myself. The steadiness they praised, I was redirecting it toward a different destination. They thought I was maintaining the ecosystem. In reality, I was designing my exit from it. Not in anger, not in secrecy born of shame, but in patience. Because if I was going to walk away from everything they believed defined me, I wanted to do it without chaos. I wanted to leave cleanly, and clean exits require quiet work. No one applauds. The moment of clarity didn't come with fireworks. It came with a number. I was sitting at my kitchen table late one Thursday night, laptop open, spreadsheets layered across the screen. I had just finished recalculating my projected expenses for the 3rd time that week, factoring in health insurance, workspace rental, and conservative income estimates from pilot workshops. I adjusted one final cell, and there it was. If I left in 6 months, I could sustain myself for 14 months of runway. Not comfort, not luxury, but time. Time to test, time to refine, time to fail intelligently if I had to. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. For years, the idea of leaving had felt abstract, emotional, risky. Now it felt logistical, possible. That was the private reveal. Not that I was talented enough, not that I was brave enough, but I was prepared enough. And preparation shifts fear into choice. I opened my savings account and looked at the balance labeled transition. I had built it quietly, increment by increment, resisting small indulgences, redirecting bonuses, saying no to upgrades I didn't need. Every dollar in that account represented something subtle: trust in self. No one had given me permission to create it. No one had advised me to. It was the first financial decision I made that was fully detached from external validation. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The city was quiet. Streetlights cast long shadows across empty sidewalks. For a moment, I imagined telling my parents. I pictured my mother's brow tightening, her voice soft but strained. I imagined my father asking for projections, poking at weak spots, not maliciously, just protectively. I realized something important. Their reaction would not determine the validity of my decision. It would only reveal how attached they were to the version of me they understood. That distinction felt freeing. Up until then, part of me had still been waiting for a sign, a push, a justification dramatic enough to make leaving unavoidable. But there was no crisis, no betrayal, no sudden layoff. If I left, it would be because I chose to. And that kind of autonomy is heavier than escape. I returned to the table and opened my notebook. I wrote, "I am not leaving because I am unhappy. I am leaving because I am ready." That sentence startled me. Ready, not rebellious, not desperate, not resentful. Ready. For the first time, the narrative shifted internally from "what if I fail" to "what if I stay too long?" That question unsettled me more because staying would be easier, applauded, predictable. Leaving would require me to tolerate misunderstanding. But here was the truth I couldn't ignore anymore. I had built enough leverage that staying was no longer the safe option. It was the stagnant one. The private reveal wasn't about money alone. It was about realizing I had outgrown the permission structure I once relied on. I no longer needed agreement to proceed. I just needed integrity. I didn't celebrate that night. There was no champagne, no triumphant music swelling in the background, just a steady breath, a quiet recalibration. I closed the notebook and turned off the lights, and as I walked to bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not certainty, but ownership. 6 months sounds like a long time, until you're counting down. Once I had the numbers, the timeline stopped being theoretical. Every calendar page I turned felt intentional. Every meeting at work felt slightly more temporary, but I still hadn't made it irreversible. Preparation creates possibility. Decision creates consequence. And consequence is where most people hesitate. I gave myself a rule. I would not resign impulsively. I would choose a date, evaluate it logically, and commit only when the data and my instincts aligned. In those 6 months, 3 options emerged. Option 1, stay on partner track, secure the promotion, build my platform slowly on the side without fully leaving. The safest hybrid. Option 2, request a sabbatical, frame it as professional development, maintain my title and return if things didn't scale. Option 3, resign cleanly, no fallback, no formal tether. Each option came with a different emotional weight. The hybrid path was attractive. It would soften my parents' reaction. It would reassure colleagues that I wasn't throwing away my career. It would allow me to test the waters without burning the bridge, but it also came with divided loyalty. Half in is comfortable, half in is socially acceptable, half in is rarely transformative. The sabbatical felt strategic, sensible, framed as growth rather than departure, but it still implied return. And something in me resisted that implication, because if I built this new path with one foot anchored to the old one, I knew I would unconsciously protect the old one. Safety would dilute risk, and diluted risk often produces diluted effort. The third option, resigning cleanly, was the most destabilizing. It meant no guaranteed salary, no predefined path back, no symbolic security blanket to soothe external anxiety. It also meant clarity. One night, I sat at my kitchen table again, notebook open, and wrote the three options across the top of a page. Under each, I listed not financial outcomes, but emotional consequences. Under option one, I wrote, respect maintained, identity preserved, energy divided. Under option two, concern minimized, narrative controlled, commitment partial. Under option three, disappointment likely, reputation questioned, focus absolute. I stared at the last line for a long time. Focus absolute. That phrase felt like oxygen. I realized that my entire life had been structured around minimizing disruption. What would it feel like to optimize for alignment instead? The next morning, I went for a run before work. The sky was pale gray, the streets nearly empty. As my breath settled into rhythm, I asked myself a single question. If no one's opinion changed how much I'm loved, which option would I choose? The answer arrived quickly. The third one, not because it was bold, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. I didn't want to be halfway brave. I didn't want to present my independence as a temporary experiment. I wanted to build something that stood on its own merit. And that required me to stand on my own, too. When I got home, I showered, dressed for work, and opened my calendar. I chose a date, 3 weeks away. Enough time to transition accounts responsibly. Enough time to finalize paperwork. Not enough time to talk myself out of it. I didn't feel adrenaline. I felt still. There's a moment when a decision moves from contemplation to commitment. You can almost hear it click internally. That morning, it clicked. I wasn't walking away from everything in anger. I was stepping towards something that felt like mine. And once I selected the irreversible option, a strange calm settled over me. Because uncertainty is exhausting, the decision is quiet. Once the date was set, everything became procedural. There was no dramatic countdown, no emotional speeches rehearsed in the mirror, just logistics. I scheduled a private meeting with HR under the neutral subject line, transition discussion. I began documenting my active projects with meticulous clarity. Client histories, forecasting notes, contingency plans. If I were leaving, I would leave cleanly. Quiet dominance isn't about shock. It's about composure. In the evenings, I finalized my LLC registration, signed the digital documents, opened a business bank account, purchased a domain name that had lived in my notebook for nearly a year. Seeing the name officially registered felt different from sketching it in pencil. It existed now, not as a dream, as a structure. I reviewed my health insurance options carefully, compared deductibles, calculated worst-case scenarios. I transferred a portion of my savings into a high-yield account dedicated to operational costs. Nothing about it felt reckless. In fact, it felt more responsible than staying somewhere I no longer intended to grow. At Sunday dinner, my mother mentioned an upcoming family trip next spring. "You'll be able to take time off easily by then, right?" she asked, casually. I smiled softly. "I'll make sure I can." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the full picture. There's something powerful about holding your decision privately until it's ready to stand. If I had announced it early, it would have invited debate, concern disguised as logic, alternative suggestions framed as a compromise. Instead, I let the structure solidify before exposing it to opinion. At work, I noticed something interesting. Because I had already chosen to leave, I stopped performing for approval. I did my job well, still thorough, still precise, but I no longer attached my identity to the praise. When my managing director said, "We're counting on you long term," I simply nodded. Internally, I understood something he didn't. Counting on someone who has already chosen a different path is an illusion. The week before my resignation, I walked through the office with unusual clarity. The framed awards on the walls, the polished conference tables, the steady hum of routine. It had shaped me, taught me discipline, taught me analysis, taught me patience. I wasn't rejecting it. I was outgrowing it. The night before my scheduled meeting with leadership, I sat at my desk at home and reviewed everything one final time. Savings, secured, business structure, filed, curriculum draft, ready for pilot launch, client transition notes, complete. I closed my laptop and allowed myself a long breath. No one had noticed. No dramatic shifts in tone. No sudden behavioral changes. From the outside, I was still Callie, the steady one, the predictable one, the anchor. But internally, the anchor had already been lifted. I slept deeply that night, not because I wasn't aware of the consequences, but because I had removed uncertainty from the equation. The next morning, I dressed carefully, charcoal blazer, cream blouse, the same calm exterior they had always trusted. There's a difference between impulsive exits and intentional ones. An impulsive exit seeks reaction. An intentional one doesn't need it. I walked into the office knowing something no one else did. My future no longer belonged to this building. The meeting lasted 18 minutes. I had timed it in my head, not intentionally, but that's how my mind works. It catalogs moments. I sat across from my managing director and the HR representative. Calm posture, steady voice. "I've decided to resign," I said. "I'll ensure a smooth transition over the next 3 weeks." There was a pause. Not shock exactly, but recalibration. "Is there a competing offer?" my director asked. "No." "A concern we weren't aware of?" "No." He leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. "Then help me understand." And there it was, the assumption that leaving must be reactive. "I'm building something independently," I replied. "It aligns more closely with my long-term direction." He blinked. "You're walking away from partner track?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, almost analytically. "That's unexpected." I didn't argue with the word. Unexpected. That seemed to be the recurring theme. We discussed logistics, transition plans, confidentiality clauses. He remained professional, but I could sense the undercurrent. Why would someone leave stability voluntarily? When I walked out of that office, nothing about the building had changed, but my relationship to it had. By the end of the day, word had spread. Colleagues stopped by my office, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You're leaving, but you're on track. I thought you were set here. Is this a temporary thing?" Every question carried the same subtext. "Why would you give up something secure?" I answered gently, "It's the right time." Some smiled politely. Others looked confused. A few looked almost unsettled. Because when the most predictable person in a system chooses unpredictability, it forces others to reconsider their own inertia. That evening, I called my parents. I didn't frame it dramatically. "I resigned today," I said. Silence, not the kind filled with anger, the kind filled with calculation. My mother spoke first. "You resigned from the firm?" "Yes." "For another position?" "No." Another silence. My father's voice entered, measured. "Callie, help us understand." I explained the plan clearly. Savings, structure, timeline, risk assessment. I spoke their language, data, projections, contingencies. But emotion doesn't dissolve with numbers. "You were so close," my mother said quietly. "So secure." "I still am," I replied. The truth was, I felt more secure than I ever had. But their version of security was institutional. Mine had become internal. "We just wish you'd talk to us first," my father said. That sentence lingered. I had talked to them before, about ideas, about possibilities. Those conversations had been softened, redirected, minimized. This time, I chose clarity over consultation. "I needed to be certain before I made it a discussion," I said gently. "No yelling, no accusations, just a shift in tone." The steady daughter had made a decision without requesting consensus. Over the next few days, the consequences continued in subtle ways. My managing director became more formal. Colleagues treated me with a kind of cautious curiosity, as if independence were contagious. At home, my mother texted more frequently. Small check-ins, recipes, weather updates. The rhythm felt slightly altered, like she was trying to reestablish familiarity. No one exploded, but the ecosystem trembled, because for the first time, I wasn't stabilizing it. I was moving beyond it, and loss, especially the loss of predictability, often arrives before understanding does. The first week after my resignation, everything felt restrained, controlled, professional at work, careful at home. But by the second week, the tremor became more visible. My managing director called me into his office again. "We've been reviewing your departure," he said. "If this is about flexibility, we can restructure your role. Reduced hours, equity adjustment, even a temporary leave." There it was, the hybrid option offered after I had already declined it internally. I listened without interrupting. It wasn't a bad offer. In fact, months earlier it might have felt generous, strategic, but now it felt like an anchor disguised as accommodation. "I appreciate that," I said evenly, "but my decision isn't about hours. It's about direction." He studied me for a long moment. "You've always been rational, Callie. This feels emotional." I almost smiled. People often label irreversible clarity as emotion. "I've planned this for over a year," I replied. "It's the most rational decision I've made." He didn't argue after that. Because once someone understands that you are not reacting, but choosing, there's little room left to negotiate. At home, the shift was quieter but heavier. My mother invited me over midweek, something she rarely did. When I arrived, she had already made tea. "I've been thinking," she began, hands wrapped around her cup. "Maybe you don't have to do this all at once. Why not try it part-time first?" The word try hung in the air, as if this were a hobby. "I am trying," I said gently. "I'm just committing fully." Her eyes softened, but worry lingered. "We just thought you were settled." That word again. Settled. As if movement were instability. My father joined the conversation later. "You've always been careful," he said. "This feels abrupt." I understood what he meant. Because they hadn't seen the preparation, it looked sudden. Silence had protected my autonomy, but it had also obscured my process. I didn't wake up and decide this last week, I said. I've been building toward it quietly. They exchanged a look, not anger, regret. Regret that they hadn't been part of the journey. And maybe, beneath that, regret that they hadn't realized I was already moving. The hardest part wasn't their disapproval. It was their confusion. They weren't trying to control me maliciously. They were trying to preserve a version of the future they understood. But preservation only works when both people agree on the blueprint. By the final week at work, colleagues were still making soft offers. If it doesn't work out, you know there's a place here. We'll keep the door open. The assumption of return lingered everywhere, and I noticed something quietly important. Everyone was negotiating from the idea that this was temporary, that I would eventually correct the deviation. But internally, the bridge had already been crossed. Offers, adjustments, reassurance. It was too late, not because I was stubborn, but because I had already shifted identities. I was no longer deciding whether to leave. I was already becoming someone who had left. The final Friday arrived without ceremony. I cleared my desk, turned in my badge, shook hands, smiled. No fireworks. No dramatic goodbye speech. Just a steady exit. When I stepped outside the building for the last time, I didn't feel panic. I felt space. And once you experience that kind of space, the kind that belongs entirely to you, there's no restructuring package that can compete with it. The real confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened at my parents' kitchen table. 2 weeks after my last day at the firm, my mother invited me over for dinner again. The table was set carefully, candles lit. The effort is noticeable. We ate quietly at first. Safe topics. Weather, Daniel's latest video metrics. Then my father folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. "Callie," he began, voice steady, "we need to ask something directly." I nodded. "Are you certain this isn't a reaction to something? Burnout? Pressure? We're trying to understand if there's something we missed." There was no accusation in his tone, just unease. I took a breath. "This isn't a reaction," I said calmly. "It's a direction." They both watched me carefully. "I wasn't unhappy," I continued. "I was misaligned." My mother frowned slightly. "Misaligned with what?" "With myself." Silence settled over the table. Not sharp, just heavy with processing. "I've always made decisions that made sense to everyone," I said. "This is the first one I made because it made sense to me." My father leaned back. "We never stopped you from doing anything." "I know," I replied, and I meant it. They hadn't forbidden me. They hadn't controlled me overtly. But expectations shape decisions, I added gently, even when they're loving. My mother's expression shifted, something between recognition and discomfort. "We just wanted you safe," she said. "I am safe," I answered, "just not in the way you're used to." That was the core of it. Their definition of safety was institutional, stable title, predictable income, clear trajectory. Mine had evolved. Safety, to me, now meant autonomy, competence, preparedness, ownership. There was no shouting, no raised voices, just a recalibration of definitions. My father asked practical questions after that. How long could I sustain myself? What were the benchmarks? What would I do if revenue didn't scale? I answered each one with clarity, not defensively, not aggressively, just factually. At some point, my mother looked at me and said quietly, "You seem different." I considered that. "I am," I said, "but I'm still me." That seemed to land, because the fear underneath all of this wasn't about money. It was about identity. If I wasn't the steady daughter on the partner track, who was I? And what did that mean for the family story? I don't need you to agree, I said softly. I just need you to trust that I didn't choose this lightly. My father nodded slowly. I can see that, he admitted. It wasn't a full understanding, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is often the turning point. When I left that night, nothing felt resolved in a cinematic sense. No hugs signaling total approval. No dramatic reconciliation. But something had shifted. The conversation had moved from, "Why would you do this?" to "Help us understand." That's not opposition. That's an adjustment. An adjustment, like growth, rarely arrives with heat. It arrives with patience. It's been a year since I walked out of that office building. My days look different now. Some mornings begin with client sessions. Independent designers, photographers, and small creative teams who once felt intimidated by financial planning. We sit across from each other, sometimes in a rented studio space, sometimes virtually. I translate numbers into a language that feels human. Other days are quieter. Curriculum revisions, marketing adjustments, budget recalculations. There are months that feel abundant and weeks that feel uncertain. But uncertainty no longer feels like danger. It feels like movement. Financially, I'm stable. Not in the predictable corporate ladder sense, but in the intentional, self-directed one. My runway didn't vanish. My projections weren't fantasies. Growth has been steady, not explosive. And that steadiness feels earned. The most surprising change hasn't been external, it's internal. I no longer introduce myself by my former title. When someone asks what I do, I don't default to the most impressive phrasing. I say, simply, I run a financial education platform for creatives. There's no defensive explanation attached, no preemptive justification, because I'm no longer negotiating my identity in the room. My relationship with my parents has evolved too. They still worry, just less urgently. My father occasionally asks about revenue trends with analytical curiosity instead of skepticism. My mother shares articles about small business growth with cautious pride. They didn't transform overnight. They adjusted gradually, and I did too. I stopped needing them to fully validate my path in order to feel secure in it. That changed the tone of everything. We talk now without the underlying tension of expectation. I visit because I want to, not because I'm maintaining a role. When they ask about my work, I share honestly, including challenges. And something unexpected happened. The more transparent I became about both the wins and the uncertainties, the more they respected the discipline behind my decision. They began to see what I had always known. This wasn't a rebellion, it was a redefinition. I'm still steady, still analytical, still careful, but those traits now serve me, not a predetermined narrative. I didn't walk away from my family. I walked away from a version of myself that felt smaller than my capacity. There's no bitterness in that. No resentment lingering beneath the surface, just clarity. If anything, I feel grateful. Grateful that they gave me the tools, discipline, responsibility, foresight that allowed me to build something sustainable. I simply redirected those tools toward a life that felt like mine. The girl who once equated safety with approval has grown into a woman who understands that alignment is a deeper form of security. And when I look at my life now, it doesn't feel like a rebellion against where I came from. It feels like a continuation on my own terms. If you had told me 3 years ago that I would voluntarily walk away from everything I had worked toward, I would have smiled politely and changed the subject, because from the outside, I had everything I was supposed to want: stability, approval, a clear path. What I didn't have was ownership. And that distinction matters more than we're taught. Walking away wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It didn't come with applause or instant clarity. It came with discomfort, with misunderstood silence, with moments where I questioned whether I was disrupting something that didn't need to be disrupted. But here's what I've learned: you can love your family deeply and still choose differently from them. You can be grateful for the path that shaped you and still outgrow it. You can walk away without anger. Quiet dominance isn't about proving people wrong. It's about no longer needing to. When I left, I didn't know exactly how everything would unfold. I only knew that staying would require me to keep shrinking parts of myself that wanted space. And shrinking, over time, becomes a kind of slow betrayal, not of others, of yourself. The truth is, most of us aren't trapped by cruelty. We're held in place by comfort, by roles that feel safe, by identities that earn approval. Breaking out of that doesn't require destruction. It requires a decision. If you're standing at the edge of something similar, if your life looks stable but feels slightly misaligned, I won't tell you to leap recklessly. I'll tell you to prepare quietly, to gather your data, to build your runway, to separate love from permission. And then, when you're ready, choose clearly. Because the most powerful shifts rarely come with noise. They come with calm. So I want to ask you something, not to provoke, not to dramatize, but to reflect honestly. Is there a version of your life you're maintaining because it keeps everyone comfortable, or because it truly feels like yours? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.